Aurelia Kane had never once cared what a ballroom full of strangers thought of her body, yet the moment Talia Voss's laugh sliced across the marble floor, something in her chest cracked wide open anyway. "Careful with the canapes, Aurelia," Talia said, pitched loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to catch every syllable. "Wouldn't want you outgrowing that dress before dessert." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was polite. The kind of laughter a room gives itself permission for, because no one standing in it would ever be brave enough to call it what it was. Aurelia smiled the smile she'd perfected at 11 years old, the one that cost her nothing and gave nothing away, and reached for a glass of champagne she didn't even want. The gold light of the chandeliers slid over green silk she'd chosen that morning because it made her feel, briefly, untouchable. It hadn't worked. It rarely did. She did not know, yet, that the man watching her from the far end of the room had already decided her name would be the last thing spoken before several people's lives changed permanently. Behind her, near the champagne fountain, her father was already deep in conversation with two board members who never once glanced her way, as if the woman who'd quietly kept 3 of their largest contracts from collapsing over the past year were simply part of the room's decoration, another arrangement of flowers no one needed to thank. Aurelia had stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago. Expecting otherwise only ever led to disappointment dressed up as surprise. Dante Marchetti did not attend galas. He attended obligations, and tolerated them the way he tolerated everything that wasted his time, silently, and with an exit already mapped. Tonight's obligation had a name. The Kane Maritime Group, whose shipping lanes his organization had quietly depended on for 2 years, officially run by an aging patriarch, who took the stage bows and shook the right hands, but according to every whisper his people had traced back through hidden correspondence, actually run by a woman nobody in this city bothered to look at twice. He'd expected someone sharp-edged, cold, a boardroom animal wearing a woman's body like a disguise. He had not expected the figure in deep green standing alone at the edge of the room, absorbing a public insult with the terrible stillness of someone who'd built an entire cathedral of self-control just to survive nights like this one, and call it survival rather than defeat. He had definitely not expected the want that moved through him low and immediate, entirely separate from the 2 years of business correspondence that had brought him here. Dante's traits were never subtle, and he'd stopped bothering to soften them a long time ago. 6'3" of quiet, expensive violence, a name that made grown men reroute entire shipments rather than risk crossing him. A signature possessiveness that showed itself in small, absolute gestures, a hand at the small of a back, a body angled between danger and whatever he decided was his. His one hidden vulnerability was one none of his enemies had ever located, because it hadn't existed until this exact moment. A woman in green silk, pretending an insult hadn't landed, who made something in his chest ache in a way bullets never had. Aurelia's traits ran deliberately in the opposite direction. Society read her as decorative, a spare heiress kept around for photographs and eventual marriage leverage, soft in a way everyone assumed meant harmless, easy, forgettable. What society didn't know was that she'd been running crisis negotiations for the family's shipping contracts since she was 24, quietly, under an alias, because her father's board would never approve of a woman, and certainly not this woman, not the daughter they'd already decided was the spare, holding any real power at all. Her controlled exterior wasn't emptiness. It was armor built one humiliation at a time, plate by careful plate. Buried beneath it was a hunger she rarely let herself name even in private, to be wanted once, without a single condition attached to the wanting. Marcus Ellery, the acceptable bachelor her father kept steering her toward at every one of these events, hovered nearby with his safe smile and his safe conversation about tariffs and golf handicaps, a placeholder of a man who had never once, not in 3 years of polite dinners, made her pulse do anything at all. The alias had started almost by accident 3 years earlier, when a shipment bound for a Kane Maritime client had been seized in a customs dispute. Nobody senior enough cared to solve at 2 a.m. Aurelia had solved it herself, from her childhood bedroom, using a burner email and a name she'd invented on the spot, because if she'd used her own, no one would have answered. The habit had never stopped. Every crisis her father's board considered beneath their attention, every deal too delicate or too dangerous for the men who took the credit, had quietly passed through her hands under a name that wasn't hers, attached to a woman none of them would ever suspect of being capable of it. She'd told herself it didn't matter whose name was on the solution, only that the solution existed. Some nights she almost believed it. The room smelled the way these rooms always did. White lilies going slightly too sweet under warm light, old money and older perfume, and beneath it all the particular electric hum of 100 people pretending not to watch each other. "I think I'll skip the rest of the seated dinner," Aurelia said to her father, low enough that only he and Marcus could hear it over the string quartet. I have a call with the Rotterdam office in an hour. Her father's jaw tightened, the way it always did when she reminded him she had a life outside the one he'd assigned her. You're being dramatic, Aurelia. I'm being efficient, she said, and turned before he could argue, before Talia's laugh could find her a second time, before the pity in Marcus's eyes could ask her to explain herself to yet another room full of people who'd already decided who she was. She didn't get 3 steps. Miss Kane. The voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once needed volume to own a room. I believe we have a mutual associate in Rotterdam. Aurelia turned, and the floor tilted slightly beneath her heels. She knew exactly who Dante Marchetti was. Every contact she'd protected for 2 years, every shipment she'd rerouted around a federal investigation without ever putting her real name on a single page, existed because of careful, anonymous correspondence with an organization she'd never expected to meet in person, let alone have its most dangerous asset standing in front of her, looking at her like she was the only person in the building worth looking at twice. I don't believe we've been introduced, she said carefully, buying herself a second to recover. No, Dante agreed, something almost amused moving behind his eyes. But you've saved my shipments twice this year under a name that isn't yours, and I intend to find out why a woman capable of that lets a socialite talk to her like she's furniture in front of 40 witnesses. Aurelia's carefully composed face slipped, just for one unguarded second. You know. I know everything that matters to my business, he said. You, Miss Kane, have just started to matter considerably more than my business. She excused herself to the terrace to breathe, and when she returned 20 minutes later, something had changed. Not her dress, not her hair, but the set of her shoulders. She'd spent those 20 minutes on the phone in the cold night air, rerouting a shipment currently 3 hours from a customs seizure, solving in real time a crisis that would have taken her father's entire legal department a week to untangle. The confidence of doing what she was actually, quietly brilliant, had settled back over her skin like a second dress, invisible to everyone in the room except one man. Dante watched her cross the marble floor again, and this time he saw it clearly, the difference between the woman who shrank herself for a ballroom and the one who just, without fanfare, saved several $1 million of cargo without breaking a sweat or losing her composure. It rearranged something in his chest, low and permanent. She wasn't decorative. She had never been decorative. Everyone in this room was simply too small, too comfortable, too incurious to see what he was seeing. You look like a woman who just fixed something, he said, peering at her elbow with a second glass of champagne he handed her without asking if she wanted it. I look like a woman who wants to go home, Aurelia said, though it wasn't entirely true anymore, and they both heard the lie in it. Let me get you an actual drink first then. His hand found the small of her back, brief, deliberate, unmistakably possessive in a way that made her pulse jump. Humor me for 10 minutes. She should have stepped away. She didn't. The lily and cologne air between them smelled suddenly like something worth staying for. Tell me something, Dante said, guiding her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows, away from the crush of the crowd. How long have you been solving problems for men who don't know your name? Aurelia considered lying. It would have been easy, practiced, automatic. Instead, she found herself telling the truth, quietly, for the first time in longer than she could remember. 3 years, maybe closer to 4 now, and in 3 years, not one of them has thought to ask who's actually been keeping the lights on. They've been too busy deciding what I'm not capable of to notice what I am, she said. And the honesty of it surprised her even as it left her mouth. Dante's jaw tightened, something dangerous moving behind his composed expression. Then they're fools, and I intend to enjoy watching them find that out. Talia found them by the bar 20 minutes later, drawn by whatever instinct cruel people develop for detecting the exact moment their target stops being an easy one. Dante Marchetti, Talia said, delighted, sliding between them with the practiced ease of a woman used to being the center of every room she entered. I didn't realize you and Aurelia were acquainted. Did she tell you she used to run the dessert table at these things before she got her own seat? She didn't tell me anything about dessert tables, Dante said. His voice hadn't changed register, but something underneath it had gone very still, very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes over. She did tell me she rerouted a Rotterdam shipment through 3 separate ports in under an hour tonight from her phone in a ball gown while you were busy making jokes about canapes. Talia's smile faltered for the first time all evening. I'd be careful who you decide to underestimate in this room, he continued, being half in front of Aurelia in a movement so natural it looked accidental and was not. I only tend to notice people once. You've already used your one turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 3 separate conversations near the bar had already gone quiet, and Aurelia felt something entirely unfamiliar rise underneath the humiliation of the whole long night. Not embarrassment this time, but a fierce, unearned gratitude that made her hate herself a little for how badly she needed it. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly, once Talia had retreated toward the safety of a different conversation. I know, Dante said, watching her with an attention that felt like standing too close to a fire. I wanted to. People like Talia have been saying things like that to me since I was 14. Aurelia admitted, prizing herself with how easily the words came, as if his stillness had pulled them loose. I stopped expecting anyone to say something back a long time ago. Then you've been in the wrong rooms, Dante said. I don't say things twice, Miss Kane, and I never say them without meaning them. Remember that. Because I intend to be saying quite a lot to you before this night is over. Something in his certainty settled over her like warmth after a long, cold walk. And for the first time all evening, Aurelia let herself want to stay exactly where she was. They were 3 steps from the coat check, his hand still resting lightly at the small of her back, when the first shot went through the front window. Dante's arm was around her before she'd finished registering the sound, hauling her down and sideways into the shelter of a marble column as the ballroom detonated into screaming and shattering glass. A second shot followed the first, closer this time, and she felt more than heard the way his whole body angled itself between her and the door, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Stay behind me, he said, and it wasn't a request. The chandelier above them swayed slightly from the shockwave of the shot, throwing broken light across the floor in shards that looked, for one absurd second, almost beautiful. Somewhere behind them a woman was screaming a name that wasn't hers, and the smell of gunpowder had already begun cutting through the lilies and champagne, sharp and acrid, and entirely wrong for a room built for celebration. 2 of his men materialized from nowhere, weapons already drawn, moving with a coordination that told her this wasn't the first time. For 4 of the longest minutes of her life, Aurelia crouched behind a man who had walked directly into gunfire without a flicker of hesitation to keep his body between her and whatever was coming through that door. She could feel his heartbeat through his jacket, steady, controlled, terrifyingly calm. When it was over, the shooter driven off by return fire she never actually saw, sirens already threading through the night outside, glass glittering across the marble like scattered ice. Dante turned her by the shoulders and checked her over with a thoroughness that had nothing professional left in it. You're hurt, he said, finding the shallow cut along her forearm where the glass had caught her. I'm fine. You're hurt, he said again, quieter this time, and something in the low authority of his voice made her stop arguing entirely. Around them, the ballroom had dissolved into a controlled kind of chaos. Guests herded toward exits by security, her father's voice rising somewhere near the stage as he demanded answers no one had yet. Marcus nowhere to be seen at all. Aurelia noticed, distantly, that the only person who had actually moved toward danger instead of away from it was the one man in the building everyone had warned her to be afraid of. He took her to a private room off the main hall himself, wouldn't let one of his men do it, and knelt in front of her chair to clean the cut with a steadiness that didn't match the tension still radiating off his shoulders like heat off asphalt. You didn't have to do this yourself, she said, watching his hands. Hands she'd been told, in whispers she'd never fully believed, had ended men's lives without hesitation. Work with a gentleness that felt like a secret only she was being allowed to see. I don't let anyone else touch what's mine, he said, and then went still, as if the word had escaped a half-second before he decided to allow it. Aurelia's breath caught somewhere in her throat. I'm not yours. Not yet, Dante agreed, taping the last of the bandage into place with careful, unhurried fingers. His thumb traced once, lightly, over her knuckles before he made himself stop. But you flinched when I said it, Aurelia, and it wasn't from fear. Court, she didn't answer, because he was right, and they both already knew it. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and, beneath that, of him. Cedar and something darker. Something she suspected she'd remember for the rest of her life whether she wanted to or not. I watched you all night before that woman ever opened her mouth, he admitted, still kneeling, still closer than any kind of propriety allowed. I watched you disappear a little every single time someone in that room decided you were less than you actually are. And I kept thinking, she runs half my shipping lane and doesn't even let herself take credit for it. Why? Because the moment I take credit, Aurelia said, and her voice cracked in a way she hadn't planned or permitted, I stop being someone my father can control, and I have never once in my entire life been allowed to be that person. Not once. You already are that person, Dante said. You have been the whole time. I just noticed before the rest of them bothered to. You almost died tonight because of me, she whispered, because you stood in front of me instead of moving out of the way. I'd stand there again tomorrow, he said, low, certain, immovable. I've buried men for less loyalty than you've shown a family that's never once said thank you to your face. Let me be the first one who does. Why does it matter to you? She asked, and it wasn't accusation, it was genuine, exhausted confusion. You've known me for 3 hours. I've known your work for 2 years, Dante said. I've read every message you ever sent under a name that wasn't yours, every solution you handed me at 3 in the morning when my own people had nothing. I built half my patience for this business around a stranger I assumed I'd never meet. Because whoever she was the only person in my world who never once asked me for anything in return. Tonight, I finally got to put a face to her, and it turns out the face belongs to a woman a room full of idiots decided wasn't worth looking at. That matters to me considerably. Aurelia felt something in her chest give way entirely. Some wall she'd been maintaining brick by brick since she was a teenager quietly cracking under the weight of being seen, fully, by someone who had no reason to lie to her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them felt more honest than every conversation she'd had all night. The distance between them had been shrinking all night without either of them naming it out loud, and when he finally closed it, it wasn't hesitant. His hand slid into her hair, tilting her face up to his with the same unshakable authority he brought to everything else in his life. And when he kissed her, it felt less like a question and more like something he'd been carefully rationing himself from doing since the moment he'd seen her across the ballroom. Aurelia's hands found the front of his jacket, fisting the fabric like she needed something solid to hold onto, and he made a low sound against her mouth that told her exactly how long he'd wanted this, how much restraint it had cost him to wait. When he finally pulled back, both of them breathing harder than the moment should have allowed, his forehead stayed pressed to hers, warm and grounding. "Say you felt that too," he murmured. "Or tell me to walk away, and I will, once, never again after that." "Don't walk away," Aurelia said. And for the first time all night her voice didn't waver at all. He kissed her again, slower this time, one hand still cradling her jaw like something rare he'd finally been allowed to hold, the other settling at the curve of her waist as if to prove to himself she was actually real and actually still standing in front of him. The scent of him. Cedar, smoke. Something underneath that was simply him, wrapped around her until the rest of the ruined ballroom, the broken glass, the sirens outside, all of it dissolved into something distant and unimportant. "I don't do this," he murmured against her mouth, an admission that seemed to cost him something. "I don't want things. I take what's useful, and I leave the rest." "And me?" Aurelia asked, breathless. "You," Dante said, "are the first thing in years I've wanted simply because you're you, and not because of a single thing you can do for me." The ballroom chaos beyond the door felt like it belonged to some other, smaller life entirely. It was past 2 in the morning when his security chief burst in with the name of the shooter, a rival shipping family retaliating for a deal Dante had closed 6 weeks earlier. Everyone in the room went tense, calculating a war none of them were fully ready for. Aurelia stood, already pulling up something on her phone, her thumb moving fast and sure over the screen. "Their entire operation runs through a customs broker my family has had leverage over for 11 years. She said, her voice suddenly crisp, entirely transformed from anything the Gala had seen of her. "I can have every one of their shipments frozen at 3 ports by morning without a single shot fired. I've done this before." "That's the alias you've been wiring payments to for 2 years, Dante." "It was always me." His security chief stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Someone near the door muttered a question no one answered. Dante simply held up a hand, silencing the room without raising his voice, the way he did everything. "Walk me through it," he said, and it wasn't a request for reassurance. It was the tone of a man who ran an empire asking his most valuable asset for a plan, and giving her the floor to deliver it. Aurelia did, fast and precise, naming ports and contacts and leverage points with the fluency of someone who had done this 100 times in the dark, unseen, unthanked. By the time she finished, his security chief was already on the phone, and the tension in the room had shifted from panic into motion. The room went silent for a beat after that. Dante looked at her the way a man looks at the exact thing he didn't know he'd spent his whole life searching for. "You're not the spare heir," he said quietly. "You never were." "No," Aurelia said, meeting his eyes without flinching for the first time all night. "I'm the one who's been keeping your empire alive for 2 years. You just finally noticed." He crossed the room, framed her face in both hands, and kissed her again. Slower this time, like a promise instead of a question, like the beginning of something neither of them intended to walk back from. "Then let's go freeze a shipping empire before sunrise," he said. "Together this time. No alias." For the first time in her life, Aurelia Kane walked out of a room she'd been humiliated in, holding the hand of the most dangerous man in the city, exactly as powerful as she'd always secretly known herself to be, and for once, she let it show. By sunrise, 3 ports had frozen the rival family's shipments exactly as Aurelia promised, and her father's board members were fielding calls they didn't understand from clients who suddenly wanted to know why the deal had gone through so cleanly. None of them thought to ask her. She didn't mind anymore. Somewhere, quietly, that no longer felt like the point. She stood at the window of Dante's penthouse as the city turned gold beneath a slow winter sunrise, still in the green dress, a borrowed jacket around her shoulders that smelled like cedar and gunpowder, and something she suspected she'd spend the rest of her life associating with safety instead of danger. "Your father's going to ask questions," Dante said, coming to stand behind her, his hands settling at her waist like they'd always belonged there. "Let him," Aurelia said. "For the first time in my life, I'm not interested in managing what he thinks." "And Talia Voss? I imagine she'll find something new to laugh about," Aurelia said, allowing herself a small, private smile. "It won't be me." Dante turned her gently to face him, tilting her chin up with 2 fingers the way he had all night, like it was a habit already, like it was something old rather than something new. "You built an empire out of a name that wasn't yours because no one would give you a seat under the one you were born with," he said. "I intend to spend considerable time making sure that never happens to you again." "That sounds like a promise," Aurelia said. "It is one," Dante said. "I only make the kind I intend to keep." Outside, the city kept moving the way it always did, indifferent to the 2 people standing at the window above it. But for the first time in longer than Aurelia could remember, she didn't feel invisible inside it. She felt, finally, exactly as seen as she had always secretly hoped to be. If you live for a mafia romance where the underestimated heroine turns out to be the one holding all the real power, hit follow, drop a like, and turn on notifications. The next chapter of Dante and Aurelia's story is coming, and you will not want to miss it. Comment below with the word Empire if you want part 2 next, because trust me, this is only the beginning of what she's capable of.